March 11th marks the one-year anniversary of the Great East Japan earthquake, one of the most powerful quakes in recorded history. The 9.0 quake triggered a massive tsunami that killed at least 16,000 people and sparked a nuclear crisis that's been called the worst since Chernobyl. Today, almost 1 year later, tens of thousands of people remain homeless in Japan. I'm Kim Krall at the International Center of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in St. Louis. Today we're talking with Reverend Glenn Merritt, Director of LCMS Disaster Response. Reverend Merritt is returning April 8th to Japan to continue work on continuing needs in Japan. Thank you, Reverend Merritt, for joining us today and updating us on our LCMS response in Japan. I understand that this is going to be your fourth trek to Japan since the horrible triple disaster. Tell us, what's the focus of the work that you plan to do there then?
Well, Kim, this particular trip, the focus will be to work with the Japan Lutheran Church on establishing the Kids Escape Camp and also a scholarship program. In the past, we've worked with Japan Emergency Lutheran Relief up in a more northern section of Japan in the Sendai prefecture and some of the other prefectures. This time we'll be returning to work for a second time in the Fukushima prefecture, where actually the Daiichi nuclear disaster occurred.
And I understand too that our Japanese Lutheran partners, they refer to this as an invisible disaster. What do they mean by an invisible disaster, and why is that so challenging?
Well, as we know, it's difficult to detect radiation. You can't see it in the air. You can't tell it's there. But there is this disaster, and it's uncontrolled at this time in terms of knowing exactly where the radiation will go, how much longer the radiation will continue to disperse, particularly across Fukushima prefecture, but also in other areas. And so they listed as the invisible disaster. We drove through some towns that were abandoned or partially abandoned, and the disaster is invisible. The towns look intact and good, but there's no children playing, there's no businesses open, there's no hospitals. So it's an invisible disaster for them, and that's scary. Anytime you can't see what's actually affecting you is scary.
Mm-hmm. And you're a disaster response veteran. You've seen the aftermath of hurricanes, earthquakes, fires, and floods around the world. And the first time you went to Japan after this disaster, you described it as the worst destruction that you have ever seen in your career. Tell us just a little bit about what you saw almost a year ago.
Well, what happened when we went almost a year ago, which was about 60 days after the disaster actually, is we saw debris fields that were scattered for miles and miles and miles up and down the coast, not just in like a tornado will usually be in a centralized location. These debris fields were scattered for hundreds of miles up and down the coast, where every single village, every single town was dramatically affected. And then the debris was scattered inland, sometimes 2 or 3 miles, depending on how far the tsunami itself came in after the great earthquake. And of course, there were buildings that had been destroyed by the earthquake itself, but the majority of the damage came from the tsunami. And there was debris, for instance, in one place about a mile up on the mountainside, you could still see debris.
Wow. Well, since that quake, caring LCMS donors have given more than $2.3 million for emergency and long-term recovery needs in Japan. Tell us just a little bit about what are some of the ways that that support has made and is continuing to make a difference in Japan.
Well, we should note that right away, the dollars which we were able to provide through the generosity of LCMS donors allowed JELR, this combination group of Lutherans in Japan, and the Japan Lutheran Church and the West Japan Lutheran Church to respond to immediate needs: food, water, shelter, clothing, medicine, those type of things. After that, we get into the intermediate phase where the NRK, our partner church, Japan Lutheran Church, has done a careful assessment of what needs there really are and how to best fill them. And what we've determined from that, from the trips that I've taken and been over there, from the way in which we've been out on the field, is that one of the unmet needs is this need to minister to children who've been affected by the radiation or affected by the tsunami. And Kim, it's interesting to me that just this morning on National Public Radio, they had a lead article on where the gentleman from Japan was talking about the need for children to have counseling after a disaster of this type. Now, he was particularly speaking about children who had been orphaned through the disaster, but he was also talking about the need for this ongoing counseling to occur. And this is the very concept behind this Kids Escape Camp.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. It sounds like such huge needs that are still there. And we know that Japan is a predominantly Buddhist country, and Lutherans are a small part of the Christian minority there. So tell us about why our Japanese Lutheran partners, why even a year later are our prayers and support needed to help them meet needs in Japan?
Well, you know, they are a relatively small percentage, the Lutherans particularly, a relatively small percentage of the Christians in Japan, about 1%. And because of that, they have a lot of obstacles to overcome in getting out there and being with people, both cultural obstacles, but also obstacles in terms of working with the government. So what they do is in keeping with what the government sees as an appropriate response. And so it's taken time to get all of that in place and to be ready to implement this kids camp and also the scholarship program for children who would come out of the Fukushima prefecture, maybe even out of Sendai prefecture or Miyagi, and come into the Tokyo area and go to one of our Lutheran schools there.
Well, thank you very much, Reverend Merritt, for talking to us. It's just so much in our hearts and minds as we approach this one-year anniversary, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you when you are in Japan, and look forward to hearing more about how Lutherans are helping to make a difference in Japan. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim.